In the sweltering summer of 235 CE, as Emperor Alexander Severus's blood stained the soil of Germanic territory, none could have predicted that this assassination would mark the beginning of Rome's longest nightmare. The murder of this young emperor by his own troops wouldn't just end the Severan dynasty, it would usher in an era that historians would later call the crisis of the 3rd century, the first major crack in the mighty Roman foundation. The Roman Empire had always prided itself on orderly succession and stability. But as news of Alexander's death reached Rome, the very fabric of this system began to unravel. What followed was a parade of soldier emperors, each claiming the purple robe of imperial power, each lasting barely long enough to warm the throne. In just 5 decades, an astounding 26 men would claim the title of emperor. The Romans had a name for this period, the time of 30 tyrants, though even this was an understatement of the chaos that ensued. Picture, if you will, the once mighty Roman army, now fractured into competing factions. Each legion felt entitled to elevate their own commander to the position of emperor. These weren't the disciplined troops of Augustus or Trajan. These were men who had learned that real power came not from Rome's Senate, but from the sharp end of a sword. The empire had effectively become a military dictatorship, but one without a single dictator. The economic impact was devastating. With each new emperor came a new round of donation payments to the troops, essentially bribes to maintain their loyalty. To fund these payments, the imperial mints worked overtime, producing coins with increasingly debased silver content. What had once been pure silver coins under Nero became mere bronze tokens washed with a thin silver coating. This debasement led to history's first documented case of hyperinflation, with prices reportedly rising by as much as 1,000% in some regions. While Rome struggled with its internal demons, external threats multiplied. To the east, a reformed Persian empire under the Sassanid dynasty emerged as a formidable enemy. In 260 CE, they achieved the unthinkable, capturing a Roman emperor, Valerian, in battle. He would spend his remaining years as a footstool for the Persian king Shapur I, a humiliation Rome had never before experienced. To the north, Germanic tribes grew bolder. The Goths, in particular, began launching seaborne raids into Roman territory, penetrating as far as Greece and Asia Minor. Cities that hadn't seen an enemy army in centuries now found themselves scrambling to rebuild long-neglected walls. The Roman Empire, which had long protected its citizens from external threats, was failing in its most basic duty. By 270 CE, the empire had effectively split into 3 competing states: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and a rump Roman state in the middle. Local leaders, seeing Rome's weakness, decided they could protect their territories better than the distant, chaotic central government. The mighty Mediterranean Empire was dissolving before everyone's eyes. It would take the military genius of several soldier emperors, Claudius II, Aurelian, and Probus, to gradually piece the empire back together. Aurelian, in particular, earned the title Restorer of the World for his efforts to reunify the empire. But the damage had been done. The crisis of the 3rd century had exposed fatal flaws in the Roman system: an over-reliance on military power, economic instability, and the challenge of maintaining unity across vast territories. When Diocletian finally restored order in 284 CE, establishing the Tetrarchy system of divided rule, he wasn't just reorganizing the empire, he was acknowledging a fundamental truth: the Roman Empire had grown too large and complex for any one person to rule effectively. His reforms would buy the empire nearly 2 more centuries of life, but the seeds of its eventual fall had been planted during these 50 years of chaos. The crisis of the 3rd century proved that even the mightiest empires could falter. It revealed that the real threats to Rome came not just from barbarian armies at the gates, but from systemic weaknesses within: military instability, economic mismanagement, and the challenge of maintaining unity across a vast, diverse empire. These lessons would prove prophetic as Rome entered its final chapters. As the dust settled from the crisis of the 3rd century, a new emperor emerged who would fundamentally reshape the Roman world. Diocletian, a former slave's son who had climbed the military ranks, took power in 284 CE with a radical vision. The empire needed complete restructuring to survive. What followed was perhaps the most ambitious reform program in Roman history, though its long-term consequences would prove deeply contradictory. Diocletian's most famous innovation was the tetrarchy, rule of 4. Recognizing that no single person could effectively manage the vast empire, he divided power between 2 senior emperors, Augusti, and 2 junior emperors, Caesars. Each would govern their own quarter of the empire, with Diocletian maintaining overall authority from his eastern capital of Nicomedia. It was a logical solution to the empire's size problem, but it institutionalized the idea that the empire could, and perhaps should, be divided. The reforms went far deeper than just administrative changes. Diocletian transformed Roman society into something more regimented and hierarchical than ever before. He introduced a complex system of price controls to combat inflation, created new bureaucratic positions, and reorganized the provinces into smaller, more manageable units. Most significantly, he formalized the separation between military and civilian administration, hoping to prevent future military takeovers. But perhaps Diocletian's most lasting impact came from his economic reforms. To maintain his expanded government and military, he needed stable tax revenue. His solution was to bind people to their professions and lands through hereditary obligations. Farmers were tied to their fields, craftsmen to their workshops, and sons to their fathers' occupations. While this secured short-term stability, it created a rigid social system that would eventually contribute to the empire's inability to adapt to new challenges. When Diocletian retired in 305 CE, the first Roman emperor to do so voluntarily, his carefully designed system quickly unraveled. Civil wars erupted until Constantine emerged victorious in 324 CE. Constantine would build upon Diocletian's reforms while adding his own momentous changes. His decision to legitimize Christianity would profoundly impact the empire's future, creating a new power structure parallel to the imperial administration. Constantine's other great innovation was the founding of Constantinople, a new capital on the site of ancient Byzantium. This decision reflected economic and strategic realities. The empire's center of gravity had shifted eastward, where the greatest threats and opportunities lay. But it also began a process of de facto division between East and West that would become permanent by the end of the century. The period following Constantine's death in 337 CE revealed the empire's continuing vulnerabilities. His sons fought each other for power, weakening imperial authority. Meanwhile, external pressures mounted. The Sassanid Persians launched new offensives in the east. Along the Rhine and Danube frontiers, Germanic peoples, themselves under pressure from nomadic Huns, began pushing into Roman territory with greater frequency and in larger numbers. The Emperor Julian's death fighting the Persians in 363 CE marked another crucial turning point. His successor, Jovian, was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty, ceding significant territory to Persia. This demonstrated that Rome could no longer maintain its traditional policy of offensive warfare on all fronts. The empire was increasingly forced into a defensive posture. By the 370s CE, the situation had grown dire. The Huns' westward migration set off a chain reaction, pushing Germanic tribes into Roman territory in unprecedented numbers. In 376 CE, the Goths, fleeing from the Huns, were admitted into the empire as refugees. When Roman officials mistreated them, they revolted. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, they achieved the unthinkable, defeating a Roman field army and killing Emperor Valens. The final major figure of this period was Theodosius I, who became emperor in 379 CE. Despite some military successes, he was forced to acknowledge a new reality. The Goths and other Germanic peoples would have to be accommodated within the empire's borders as semi-autonomous allies, foederati. While this provided short-term stability, it fundamentally altered the nature of Roman power and society. Upon Theodosius's death in 395 CE, the empire was formally divided between his sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. This division, intended to be purely administrative, would prove permanent. The Western Empire, burdened by greater external threats and fewer resources, would begin its final decline. The East, meanwhile, with its greater wealth and more defensible position, will survive as the Byzantine Empire for another millennium. The period from Diocletian to Theodosius demonstrated both the resilience and the fundamental weaknesses of the Roman system. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine bought the empire valuable time, but they also created new problems while failing to solve underlying issues. By 395 CE, the stage was set for the final act of the Western Empire's long drama. The year 395 CE marked the beginning of the Western Roman Empire's final chapter. As the young Honorius took the Western throne at the tender age of 10, few could have predicted that he would be one of the last emperors to rule from Rome. The empire he inherited was already fundamentally different from that of Augustus or Trajan. It was an empire that had been forced to adapt to new realities, and not always successfully. The first major crisis of this period arrived with alarming swiftness. In 405–406 CE, a massive coalition of Germanic peoples, including Vandals, Alans, and Suevi, crossed the frozen Rhine River into Gaul. This wasn't a mere raid. It was a full-scale migration of entire peoples, complete with families, livestock, and wagons. The Western Empire's northern frontier, already strained, effectively collapsed. Meanwhile, another drama was unfolding within the empire itself. Stilicho, Honorius's half-Vandal guardian and general, had been maintaining a delicate balance between Roman and Germanic interests. When Honorius had him executed in 408 CE, largely due to court intrigue and anti-Barbarian sentiment, this balance shattered. The aftermath was catastrophic. Thousands of Germanic soldiers in Roman service defected to Alaric, the leader of the Visigoths. What followed was perhaps the most symbolic moment of Rome's decline, the sack of the Eternal City itself. In 410 CE, Alaric's Visigoths entered Rome and plundered it for 3 days. While the material damage was relatively limited, the psychological impact was immense. Saint Jerome, writing in distant Bethlehem, captured the mood. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. The next decades saw the Western Empire's territory steadily contract. The Vandals crossed from Spain into Africa, eventually capturing Carthage in 439 CE. This was perhaps the most devastating blow of all. North Africa had been Rome's breadbasket and main source of tax revenue. Without it, the Western Empire's economic foundation crumbled. By 450 CE, effective Roman control was largely limited to Italy and parts of Gaul. Even there, real power increasingly lay with Germanic military commanders serving as kingmakers. The most powerful of these was Ricimer, who dominated Western Roman politics from 456 to 472 CE, making and unmaking emperors at will. The final act began in 475 CE, when the Germanic general Orestes installed his young son Romulus Augustulus as emperor. The boy would be the last Western Roman emperor, though he never exercised any real power. In 476 CE, another Germanic officer, Odoacer, decided to cut through the fiction of continued Roman rule. He deposed Romulus Augustulus but, significantly, didn't claim the imperial title for himself. Instead, he returned the Western imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that one emperor was sufficient for both East and West. So what really caused Rome's fall? The answer lies not in any single factor, but in a complex interplay of long-term weaknesses and acute crises. Economic decay. The Western Empire's economy had been gradually deteriorating for centuries. Hyperinflation during the crisis of the 3rd century had never been fully resolved. The loss of North Africa to the Vandals dealt a death blow to imperial finances. Military changes, The army had become increasingly reliant on Germanic recruits, while also losing its technological edge. The heavy cavalry introduced to counter Germanic and Persian threats was expensive to maintain and required specialized training. Political instability, the lack of a clear succession system meant that civil wars remained common, weakening the empire's ability to respond to external threats. Demographic shifts, the empire faced massive population movements it couldn't control. The Hunnic migration set off a chain reaction that pushed Germanic peoples into Roman territory in numbers too large to assimilate in traditional ways. Administrative division, the split between East and West, while logical from an administrative standpoint, meant that the Western Empire couldn't draw on the East's superior resources and defensive position. Social rigidity, Diocletian's reforms, while providing short-term stability, had created a rigid social structure that couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. Religious tensions, while often overstated, the rise of Christianity did create new power centers and occasionally diverted resources and attention from secular concerns. Perhaps most fundamentally, the Western Roman Empire fell because it lost the ability to control its own destiny. Its economy, military, and administration became increasingly dependent on Germanic peoples who maintained their own independent power bases. When these groups decided that the fiction of Roman rule was no longer necessary, the Western Empire simply ceased to exist. Importantly, this wasn't so much a violent overthrow as a gradual transformation. Many Roman institutions and cultural elements survived under Germanic rule. The Eastern Empire continued for another millennium as the Byzantine Empire, and the idea of Rome, of universal empire and civilized order, would influence European political thought for centuries to come. The fall of Rome teaches us that even the mightiest empires can collapse when multiple systemic weaknesses coincide with external pressures. It's a lesson in the importance of adaptability, the dangers of institutional rigidity, and the complex interplay between economic, military, and social factors in determining the fate of nations.